This week, I am very pleased to welcome back to the show the one and only Greg Carlwood. Greg, how you doing?
Hey man, doing really well and psyched to be doing what we're doing today.
Yeah. I remember you've only been on once before, which is criminal. Actually,
That's
it's
appropriate.
shameful.
It's appropriate. I'm not an
Last
expert
time
in
you were on,
anything. I told you
oh,
about
here you
my
go
couple
again.
weird
Here you,
experiences.
yeah, yeah, here you go again. So last time you were on, I spent ages attempting to do like a classic THC style intro, which I didn't have the time to do, which I spent too much time on and then didn't have enough time to put questions together for you. This time I spent all my all this morning on the slides instead, and then I get to the end and go, God damn it, I should have done an intro. So
Yeah,
on your third time on the show, I'll get everything right.
I like
But
it.
yeah, super excited to have you on, and we're heading towards the end of the year, so I thought we're going to do some fun things for the last few episodes, and in this case, we are going to be talking about counting down even the top 10 conspiracy books of all time. Now, how was this for you as a challenge?
Well, I liked it because I thought it would be a lot easier when you first proposed it. And by the way, I'm going to pour myself a drink of the appropriately named Rabbit Hole whiskey, uh,
Excellent.
just because the day has been long, man.
All right.
Dad life, I'm going to take the opportunities I can to have a
Yeah.
drink with a buddy. But yeah, the process was great. I actually hoped we would start talking a little bit about the logic of the lists before we got into the actual books on the list, because I found myself really narrowing down
Yeah.
the definition of a conspiracy book. There were a lot of paranormal ish books like Missing 411. Is that a
Yep.
conspiracy? The Parks Department is hiding something, but is it more of a paranormal thing? And then
Yeah.
so I found myself going through that process and weeding out a lot of things so that I didn't have to take the blame for them not being on the list. Sorry, they're great books. They're just not in the narrow parameters of the category I created. I also excluded fiction. I don't know if you did that. I expect yours to be a little more highbrow than mine. I expect maybe
Right.
some Quigley or some Orwell. Like I wouldn't be surprised if there's a fiction book or two in yours. But I just think lately I've been so uh not obsessed really, but just focused on what's coming down the pike and the things that are happening in our time. So many of my books are about the times. And
Yeah.
I started the list with like, oh, let's make categories for conspiracy and let's get the best MK Ultra book. Let's get the best 9/11 book. And then I thought, no, because I couldn't even come up with 10 categories. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
wanted to cover the spread, but I also wanted all of them to be relevant to today. So there's some great books that I didn't include because, like, Dark Mission, it's occulty, it's NASA, it's provocative. But what are you going to do with that? You know,
No,
we are
exactly.
we are in the 11th hour in a lot of ways to some stuff. And so a lot of my book choices relate to that in some way. And
Yeah.
the mindset I'm always in with this is if I wanted to convince someone of X and I only had one book to do it with, what would I give them? That was also in my head when picking the
No,
books.
I could tell it was mine. So some of the books that I wanted to have on the list for that kind of reason of like, well, if I could just have like one Atlantis book, right? It would have
Yeah.
been Graham Hancock's Underworld, but it's not a conspiracy.
Yeah.
And however much, unfortunately, in recent years, he's tried to make it one with him saying that all of archaeology is against him and they're hiding this kind of stuff. That's not true. That's not actually what's going on. But the actual story still isn't there in I dare we say mainstream acceptance for that reason, but that's not the story of Underworld, right? So, which I think is
Mhm.
his best book before he did get a bit loosey goosey towards the end of it in the Netflix phase of his career, shall we say? But it's not a conspiracy, so there's like no Atlantis stuff in there, and I had the same kind of logic, and my narrowing down went more like it's almost like a Catherine Fitz thing. I'm like, if I can, what are the books I will use to explain the last 70 years to people? Like what are the
Yeah.
books I
Yeah.
will use to give people an understanding of essentially how I think the planet is governed? So
Mhm.
I kind
Mhm.
of went sort of down that direction. But it's like we were saying beforehand, what that's meant is because we've both picked a book each and there's 10 books, there's only one overlap. And it comes up on my list before yours, so you can poke a face on it. That's the other
Okay.
thing. Greg doesn't know what's on my list yet, so there's going to be some
Right.
prize there. But what that means for people listening and watching is you kind of get 19, kind of get 19 books, and hopefully at the end, because you in particular, like when you sent through your long list, and they're all on the long list, there's all this really good stuff, right? But the trouble is, um, it's like it felt like for you in particular, because you have to do this once a week and you've done this once a week for years now. It felt like a Sophie's Choice situation.
Mhm.
Like, oh, but these books are
For
so
all my
good. And
babies.
yeah. Yeah. But this mine ended up, I had the thing that missed kind of on my list is I wanted to do some MK Ultra stuff as well because I feel like that's sort of important, and it's there in some of the books, and we'll sort of
Mhm.
explain when we get to it. It'll kind of be obvious, but it's that same situation of like, well, how do you? Well, it's been for me like a more challenging and fun project than I expected as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be really good. I'm going to jump back into the slideshare because yes, even before we get to the countdown, I
Ah.
actually was going to open with like, what is the rationale for your for the books that are included on the list? And I'm glad we got that there because the other reason this is for people listening and watching, and if you are listening, like if you're driving, honestly, the slides are just pictures of book covers, so you don't need to run off and watch the video. You can listen, and you'll get the same thing anyway. But people who listen to this show and people who listen to your shows will probably have some stringent opinions about what has been included and what hasn't been included. So it's kind of exciting in that level, on that level too. But because of that, I did want to start with like, here is my logic, because there's gonna be a bunch of people recommending excellent books. And in fact, I would even say on both our lists, there are some flawed books
Oh,
that
yeah.
have to be
Yeah.
included. Like, this isn't our favorite books of all time. This is what we heard, what your logic was, which is like, if I have only 10 books to explain what's going on right now, this is what I'm going to give people. Mine was like, dare I say, explaining Mr. Global, like whatever the Anglo-American establishment is. So if I had 10 books to do that, more or less, that's what I'm doing. So people are going to be like, what about this? What about this? And I'm quite sure, I mean, some of the suggestions will be shit, but some of them will be really good. And all I can tell you is, we only had 10.
Right. Like a good example is like because the networks, right? You could get a book on each individual network. Like Anthony Sutton has a great Skull and Bones book,
Yeah.
Daniel Estelin has a great Bilderberg book, and then Russ Baker has an amazing Bush family book, Family of Secrets. And it's so thick and it's great, but like, is the Bush family influence that important going forward? And if you start going into all these different networks, there's 10 networks.
I know.
So
So
it's like, do you
my version
include
of
Skull
that,
and
yes.
Bones or whatever?
Like the Dulles brothers, there's an excellent Dulles brothers book, but like,
Mhm.
they'll show up in my books. They show up in some of the ones in yours as well. So that's kind of the other thing we're looking at here is literally it's just 10. Let's do an overview, and
Mhm.
I'm excited for it. Anyway, so
Me too.
let's jump on in. Number 10, Gregory. Tell us
Mhm.
about Nick Bryant's The Franklin Scandal.
Yes, well, I think a lot of people are familiar with it to a degree, but it is one of the most famous child trafficking story books. I mean, the Franklin scandal, it touches on so many things, obviously a lot of politicians, and he's such a thorough researcher. I'm just a big Nick Bryant fan, and it's a case study and obviously something that is a wider problem. One of the things that I consider most unique about it is it's really one of the only examples I know where the actual victims did time for perjury. First off,
Mm,
not a lot of this stuff makes it to the actual courtroom. But then the people, the kids who got, I can't remember exactly the age they were when they took the stand, but they're like, hey, this happened to me. And then the court case obviously went in favor of the criminals. And so, by definition, they lied and they went
yeah,
to jail. And
yeah,
it's
yeah,
like, wow, what a life. What a
yeah,
life. Trafficked by the political elite and used in a blackmail ring, and in some cases, used as a drug mule. then you tell your story, you're brave enough to do so, and you see the real corruption in the world, and you go to prison for talking about it.
Yeah.
Nuts.
So this is obviously, we may assume, one of the purposes of the QAnon op was to make ideas like this ridiculous, because the Q story is ridiculous. But this, I'm glad you included on this list because it's not on mine. I'm actually pretty happy with everything that's on your list. Like, they're good books, right? Because it's sort of, when people dismiss the idea of high level child sex abuse as something to do with pizza and whatever. So, no, here you go. Here's one.
Mhm.
Here's one long before any of that. And for the people who are typically dismissive of that kind of stuff, they do tend to vote blue rather than red. There's a bit of both in this one, but they're also, it's more red in this
It
book,
is
if you
more
will.
red.
So they
Mhm.
kind of like, they might be more inclined to go, gosh, there really is or was something going on at that level. So I really
Yeah.
liked the inclusion of it, and it's sort of similar for the real Anthony Fauci, which is my number 10. Is if you are, because it is about, and it's just, you know, God bless this Kennedy, at least in particular, right? And to have that sort of relentless, legalistic patience and diligence to put out a doorstop takedown, not just of Fauci, but like coming into what we've just been through over the last, still in over the last 3 years, it was sort of, I was surprised at how limited people's understandings about things like the pharma industry and corruption to do with that actually was. So if there
Mhm.
was one book, and it's a this year book, right? Like it came out end of last year, but like within the last 12 months, right? So if there was a book that you were going to give people to go like, listen, just read this. It's by a celebrated environmental lawyer and a Kennedy,
Mhm.
and he hasn't been sued for it because every one of the claims is backed up. And
Right.
just read through it, and I'm not telling you what to do with injections or your body or anything, but you will not see the incestuous and demonic combination of like government regulation and approval and big pharma the same again, right? Because
Yes.
there's like kids being killed and illegal experiments on American children and all this kind of stuff that isn't. Um, it's as wild. It's funny that it ended up on the same page really as the Franklin scandal, because it does kind of indicate that there is a class of people that truly does not care about children, shall we say, to be able to do stuff like this. So that was
Yes.
for me. It's like, here's a book. You've got some, well, there are some excellent books out there on pharma and all that kind of stuff, because biology and health is the center of human life, right? But
Mhm.
here's the one where it's like, okay, it's almost like a gateway one. Like, if once you've read this, you will be kind of like more open to
Yes.
perhaps some of the other stuff that's on the list.
And one of the commonalities between these two is the thickness. I mean, I got the real Anthony Fauci digitally because I was lucky enough to interview RFK Jr. about it. So they sent me a media copy. It's digital, but I imagine it's about this thick.
Yeah,
And I felt like I couldn't, again, going back to my thoughts about categories, I couldn't have a top 10 list without a child trafficking expose
yeah,
on it. So this is the one. And they're both meticulously researched. He includes a lot of the actual correspondence in the back of the book, letters, emails, that kind of thing. So the diligent research of both of these books is on
yeah,
that next level, is what makes them great. And RFK, I mean, he's got the resources, but he had a team of people going over each individual sentence. There's over 1,000 footnotes in that book.
yeah,
It's ironclad. As you
yeah.
say, he hasn't been sued, but it's ironclad because the stakes were that high. And he already knows he's going up against a giant torrent of propaganda. So it has to be ironclad. And he took his shot, and I think he crushed it.
I think so too. My mother even bought it, and she doesn't. She's not, shall we say, a regular listener of, well, maybe me. I don't know, but I remember chatting to her, and she's like, "Oh, my real Anthony Fauci showed up." And I'm like, "Wow!" So that made it to like regional Australia. It's not, he, however powerful Anthony Fauci is, he doesn't actually have jurisdiction here. But she bought it, and so like it made it international. To your point, because obviously there was, as you'd expect, media silence and claims from like people in Kennedy's camp that like this is a best-selling book, it's selling really well, and so on. And there it was, like my mother managed to find it in Newcastle, Australia, so it probably was. And I think he did take his shot, and I think it hit. I really do. I think it really shifted the opinion and narrative. But if you've got people who are like, have got a spare 15 hours and are open enough, it's a good gateway. I think it's the other reason. So when we get towards the top of the list, it's funny when you count down a list. This doesn't mean that this book is 10 times worse than my number one. My thinking
Right.
for the 10th book at least was, what's the gateway book? What's the book that is like, because both of our lists get a bit wild and woolly. What's the gateway book that you can give to anyone to start them off? Like if you were gonna almost like, and Christmas is coming up, doing like the 10 conspiracy books of Christmas. Like, okay, read this one today and this one the next day, and so on, counting down. Real Anthony Fauci or Franklin Stickhandle is like a good thin end of the wedge, I think.
For sure. Depending on your subject matter, yeah, they fill that need of a gateway, I think, in both
Yeah.
cases.
These two also oddly related, but tell me about Population Control by. Oh, actually, I have to tell you my Jim Mars story first. So, because it pertains to you, I
All right.
finally got myself into a THC song. This is obviously about 10 years ago now, whenever it was, because I remember I was flying into Hamburg, and I'm like, I was chuffed that I made it into a THC song back in the day when that was one of the things. And not only that, I was in a THC song that also mentioned Jim Mars. And I'm like, wow, that's quite cool. And I was listening to possibly his last turn on THC. This is almost 10 years ago. And towards the end, I forget what it was, but he started saying something about Black people being naturally more violent or something. And I'm like, oh, Jim, I just made it into the song.
Uh,
What are you
I
going to do
don't
to
even
me?
recall that. I mean, he is
Yeah.
the kind of, I call him the conspiracy papa bear, which is kind of like conspiracy grandpa. And so you're going to get a little of that with the conspiracy
Well,
grandpa.
yeah, because I watched it even longer ago, like early days of YouTube, a presentation he was giving somewhere else in Texas, and he has that Texas grandfather opinion of like, this is America, here you should speak American, and the crowd, to their credit, was like, I don't think that's right. Like he was trying to say, this is America, you should speak English, and so you're in the southern states, read the room a little better, I would say there. So he has this kind of like, I guess, grandfather at he had maybe some grandfather at Thanksgiving opinions.
Hmm.
But I just wanted to say, like, I remember walking out into the snow in Hamburg, listening to the end of a THC up with Jim Mars going, Jim, I just made it into the song. What are
I
you
get
doing?
that. The association, you wanted
Yeah.
it, now you don't want it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's hilarious. And I really liked Jim Mars, despite that little anecdote about the racism. But and there were a couple of books of his I wanted to include. Our Occulted History is really
Mm,
good, and it kind of gets into the ancient aliens thing. So he had some really weird stuff. Obviously, he's known for his JFK material. I think that's some of his least interesting material. I guess just the era I grew up in, conspiracies were, oh, you're into aliens, Bigfoot, and JFK. And I was like, well, aliens and Bigfoot are quite epic stories for a young kid, but JFK, so you killed a guy, you killed a president. Okay. Shadow government killed a
yeah.
guy. And it's not mind blowing to me, as mind blowing as aliens and Bigfoot. So obviously, there's an op there to make the political conspiracies seem as dumb as a monkey man in the woods and stuff. But from a kid's perspective, I was just like, two of these are really interesting. One of them is not so much. But this is on the list because this is one of my generalist, hits all the
Mm,
bases, everything on the bingo card books. I mean, it's not as thorough as some books. It's not the most thorough book about EMFs, but it's in here. It's not the most thorough book about GMOs, but it's in here. So you can see on the cover, and these are kind of the chapter names, like bad water, bad energy, bad
yeah.
air, bad food, bad drugs. The first chapter is the gods cartel, guns, oil, and drugs, trafficking. So to me, this is the book that I included to cover the general spread of CIA coups and all the trafficking and just how we're really being attacked. And this book, obviously, he's been dead a few years, came out well before COVID, but it also
For sure.
teaches you a little bit about regulatory capture. And it's also the one book I included that it says how corporate owners are killing us, because
Yeah.
I think that there's an underemphasis on the corporations at the head of every industry. And I don't know why, but to me, it's something I emphasize all the time, is just how easy regulatory capture is, and how you can find a company in every sector of the societal pie: food, medicine, obviously sometimes the same thing, air, energy, that is just completely corrupt and probably putting out some kind of products that are deadly to people. And this is
Yeah.
the book that is going to cover that spread, and give you a general impression of, oh man, I guess nothing's all that great in this world. And we should
Yeah.
know it isn't. I mean, we know our water is awful. Chemicals, chemical
Doesn't
coated
Houston have
water
to
through.
boil it like right now as we're recording? Isn't there like a boil water requirement in Houston right now? I'm
That
sure
I
there
don't
was.
know. The last
Yeah.
one I knew of was Mississippi, and I saw some great memes that are like, the US government can send so many billion to Ukraine, so many billion to Israel. When it comes to Mississippi, it's like, boil your water. We
Yeah.
don't have any money for our own state
Exactly.
that is in a crisis right now.
Yeah.
Seems to be how things are going these days, but that is why it's on the list. Is I felt like I needed a Jim Marrs book on the top 10 list, period. And even though there were three other choices, including his one about banking, that is
Yeah.
probably a hole in my game today. Is I don't have a dedicated banking book, but it is weaved throughout so many of them. But that's why this is on there. It's down low on the list, but I needed to cover the spread.
No. So I had so mine for people listening. So that's Population Control, Jim Mars. Mine is Nazi International by Joseph P. Farrell. And Joseph Farrell, when he writes a good book, does an excellent job of relying on other research in the field, right? So this book, Dark Mission isn't on my list, but Richard Hoagland's in this book because obviously there's the kind of rat lines in from Nazi Germany into the foundation of NASA and so on. So this is a really good book to cover something that actually did happen, which at least for a while there was a Nazi International. There was Martin Bormann signing checks under his own name, like Chase Manhattan checks in the 70s, right? So this is a book to kind of show that, as a matter of fact, going in and out of war, coming back to things like corporations and people in power, they really don't care. they
Right.
will help and collude with Nazis and the rest of it, right? So this is another one of those books that because other books in his Nazi series, like To Do with the Bell and the rest of it, are more speculative, but this one's pretty much just the available evidence at the time for which high-level Nazis, including Hitler, may have, because a bunch of them may have actually survived, and mostly in South America, but elsewhere, right? And to kind of look
Mhm.
at where that interplays with American corporations and banking and the beginning of the space race. So I kind of wanted to put that in there because as I said, it's a bit polemical. It's sort of building a story of how the best view I think we can get for how power is organized on the planet over the last 70 years. So I included Joseph, and it's the same thing. It's like, this isn't a perfect book, but it's on the list because it covers an area that I think is crucial to understand, I think, which is
Mhm.
part of that post-war power vacuum. All right.
Yeah, I love Joseph Farrell, obviously. He's one of the few people who has probably been on my show more than 4 or 5 times. Not a lot of people make it past, 3 or 4, because they just don't put out this much material. And I do love his books. It's funny I made the comment about not having a finance book on here, because I was so close to trying to squeeze 2 in with Babylon's Bankers
Yeah.
and Financial Vipers of Venice, because he made these 2 really good finance books and then wove in kind of a esoteric, occulty philosophy behind fractional reserve banking. I mean, the subtitles are Babylon's Banksters, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion, and then Financial Vipers of Venice, Alchemical Money, Magical Physics, and Banking in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. I just love those titles, and it makes the banking thing way more interesting to think it came out of a kind of a cult philosophy of
Yeah.
nullification and all that kind of stuff he gets into. But it's a shame I don't have a Farrell book on the list, but I did try to make those two fit. If we had 15 books, I'm sure it would have been there,
Exactly.
but Nazi International is
Yeah.
also one of
I
his
looked at both
masterworks.
of them too, right? Because particularly the Financial Vipers of Venice one, he's very interested in power vacuums, right? And like
Yeah.
and Venice's kind of rise into power and it kind of winning a war against all of Europe and then kind of infecting different courts as it ostensibly declined in power is basically mainstream history. Like that happened, and so that's one of those moments in history that people kind of don't realize that there are still families in Italy and banking families and so on that still have those kind of power and connections that were formed then. But it does have stuff that is, which he would admit as well, like he would say high octane speculation or crawling out on the twig or whatever, because that's how he writes his books. Because I looked at them too for like, do I need a banking book? And I wanted it to be that one. And they're great reads. And I'm not saying he's wrong about. I think like when it comes to debt and kind of like debt-based financing, it is a spell. It's literally time magic. It may not be exactly as he described it, but yeah, I'm glad I got a Joseph Farrell on the list because this is a good one to have there, and he deserves it because he has
Yes.
written another book whilst we've been talking. Yeah.
Indeed.
All right, number 8, Greg, you went with Virus Mania. Tell me.
Yeah, this is another one where I felt like I needed a medical book that was going to cover the spread. Now, this is a re-release because the original one didn't have coronavirus COVID-19 in it, but they updated it. So that was another thing that made it a notch higher on the hierarchy of medical books. It also is probably not the best one I've read, but as the subtitle says, I mean, the medical industry, it's called Virus Mania, how the medical industry continually invents epidemics, making billion-dollar profits at our expense. And it covers COVID-19, measles, swine flu, cervical cancer, avian flu, SARS, BSE, hepatitis C, AIDS, polio, and more. And I mean, I got it right here for those who are watching. It is a thick book. It covers a lot of stuff because when you go down this rabbit hole, you're like, well, what about this one? Well, what happened in this case? You know, because we have all these stories like Spanish flu in our heads. And so when someone's trying to almost make the case that viruses aren't a threat, you're like, whatever? Well, what about this case? What about that case? And it's like, well, flip to it. They've got a story for you.
Yeah.
And so it covers the spread. And it was tough to decide which one of these kind of books was going to make it. What really makes us ill is even thicker. I interviewed
Yeah.
those authors and I liked that book too, but I felt like we have an MD on this one. It's got a little more of a professional, not that their book is inaccurate, but they're researchers and this is like an MD and another doctor. And so I felt like the credibility factor was there if you're trying to convince people. Uh, I also wanted to, at this point, mention another book that is kind of in line with this that almost made my list called Turtles
Turtles all
All
the
the
way
Way
down. Yeah,
Down.
yeah, yeah. Great
Now,
book.
for people who don't know anything about this one focuses on vaccine science and myth, basically. I mean, that's the subtitle, Vaccine Science and Myth. So it's not my words, it's theirs. But what is so interesting about this and provocative is it's written by an anonymous, some say Israeli medical expert, doctor. And Steve Kirsch has put out on his Substack, hey, if you can he basically is like, I got a bounty for anyone who finds a flaw in the science of this book, in the facts of this book. I don't know, it's like $5,000 or something if you can prove something wrong in this book. So, you know, it's got the provocativeness of it being an anonymous author who clearly knows their shit but was afraid to like attach their name to it but thought it needed to be out there. It's got an interesting title for a book about vaccines and I really wanted to put it in there, but I just thought Virus Mania, it covers vaccines because they are part of the story, but it goes a little bit further and includes some material that Turtles All the Way Down doesn't include.
Yeah.
Dissolving Illusions was also a contender because Dr. Judy Mikovits talks about that as the book that red pilled her on all of this, the ops going on in the medical world. So that was
This
another
one, yeah.
tight contender.
This one fits more in a like there are conspiracies in this book. Like there are naked
Yeah.
corporate conspiracies so kind of like fits on this list because What Really Makes Us Ill, What Doctors Don't Tell You, all those kind of books are excellent, right? Um, but it's a conspiracy book list, so I'm glad you included this, and it is one of those ones. Similarly, one of the books that didn't make it on my list was Invisible Rainbow,
Mm.
because these are kind of books that you can give people, because whether you're kind of like terrain theory or not is now a highly weaponized position, where a couple of years ago it wasn't. Like you could actually just be terrain theory because most medicine was moving in that direction. So you can kind of give people these books. I like Invisible Rainbow because again it's written by a doctor who isn't in fact a terrain theorist. Like he has to do that kind of weird thing where it's like, oh, EMF activates viruses, or whatever, and that's how you get the flu, or so on, right? I don't care. I don't know which one it is, right?
Mhm.
But but it's not a conspiracy, and so like because I wanted that one in there. I'm glad we kind of your list has a bunch of medical stuff in it because again these are the times we live in. So
Yeah.
really good choice for 8. I went kind of like classic, psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain, because this was before our time, but a bombshell like during the Cold War in the 70s when it came out, to kind of realize that the Soviets had 24 psi facilities, and the US, as far as at least the public and most of the military was aware, had maybe one. Right? And so it's again a peek behind what um, what powerful people were interested in the 20th century, particularly in the post-war period, because this
Yes.
stuff plainly worked. And the stuff that you could learn in a Soviet system was very fascinating, right? Because if they had to conform, I wrote about this in Animistic, they had to conform to Marx's idiotic metaphysics because they were socialists. So it was all kind of like materialist crap. Which meant that they had to kind of like invent physical explanations for stuff like psi, uh, and telepathy and all that kind of stuff, which meant that they started doing cool shit with like growing crops under pyramids, and working out what material blocked telepathy and remote viewing, and so on, because it had to have a physical function because they were socialist scientists. And consequently, like the secret programs, not that they were that secret in the Soviet Union, they were just secret from us, were quite developed. And also it's cheap. They couldn't outspend the US, and so if there's like a force multiplier you can get from psychic spies, then they're going to pursue it. So I think a lot of people, even in conspiracy land, should take a second look at what went on in the Soviet Union, because they had a different kind of like environment in which to study, both like metaphysically and also from a needs basis, right? And so
Mhm.
there's some amazing stuff that's in there, and it feeds into what then went on to happen with like the Stargate program, and other things that we sort of know about, and different kind of like MK sub projects as a result of realizing how far behind the Soviets, the West was. So it's kind of one of those really, it's a book that's kind of about the world of psi and the paranormal in a way, but it fits in a conspiracy list, I think, because it's one of those things that just gives you like a flash, or turning a light on in a large room just briefly, and like you can look around and see what probably went on. So that's why it's on my
Yeah.
list at number 8.
It is a great book. It is on my shelf. I haven't read it cover to cover, but I learned about it in a Joseph Farrell book, Microcosm and Medium, I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure. And he cites it at length. And I was like, I got to get this source material that you're referencing here. But he presents it in like it's MK Ultra adjacent. It's their program for this kind of stuff, but it isn't as harsh. It isn't as abusive. It doesn't seem on its participants. They're doing things like listening to classical music and memorizing French in a night. MK Ultra is like drugging people until they jump out of the 12th story window.
yeah.
And so to
Experimenting
me
on
it's like,
children, all the rest of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So
the it's the
when you end
positive
up
side
being
of side.
yeah, when you end up being crueler than the Soviet Union, you've really lost your way. But
Yeah.
yes.
Great book to be on the
Nice.
list. It was on my long list, didn't make the short one.
Nice one. All right, number 7, you've got
Oh.
Dumbing Us Down by John Taylor
Uh-huh.
Gatto.
Yes. Dumbing Us Down is a really great book. John Taylor Gatto was a teacher for over 3 decades, and then he came out with this book. I also love to mention the subtitles, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. what better guy to write the book that's the quintessential education conspiracy book? I feel like that's another one of those categories I had to have on the list, because
Yeah.
what is more important than, or foundational than, education? Not only the material, how history is taught, how science is taught, what's left out, but also just the history of forced schooling. I don't know if it's different there, but here, obviously, it's so taken for granted in the modern world that it's illegal to not go to school before you're 16 in a state accredited institution. I went to private school, but it's not any different. It's the same stuff plus Jesus. And I just think it's really good at teaching people about themselves if they went through that system. Like, there's some obedience training built in. There's a lot of Pavlovian response type stuff with the bells ringing and just the shuffling around. Even homework is like, well, be prepared in the corporate world to take your work home with you.
Yeah.
We've been conditioning you for that since childhood. And the other element is just how it's more about, memorization and compliance than free thinking and creativity. Maybe I have a chip on my shoulder about my education experience. And I just thought it deserved a space because it affects us all. And it's so foundational to the ways we think, the trust we have in the system. Because, yeah, the system sets you up to trust it. I pledge
Yeah.
allegiance to the flag every day. Children, what are we doing? So that's why it's on my list. I don't know if he has passed on now, but he's very close. I remember him being quite sick. I interviewed his protege about his book. It's one of the rare times where I interviewed someone about someone else's book, but I'm glad I did because it's just so important. And you got an
Yeah.
interesting one on here too.
I went with Death on Mars by John Brandenburg, who he's been on both. Well, actually, I interviewed him for Skeptico, but I needed, kind of like what you said about the Jim Mars Our Cult of History, I needed an Ancient Aliens book that didn't annoy me. And I wrote one of them, but it's not a conspiracy book. So I couldn't put mine on, and also that's insane. I couldn't put mine on the list. And Dr. Brandenburg, as a plasma physicist, has, I think, the best evidence for, because wherever you want to come down on, and I do think there a bunch of it's artificial, the kind of the stuff that's on Mars, the Cydonia complex and so on, wherever you want to come down on that, there is a uranium weapon signature in the Martian atmosphere. And JPL and other kind of organizations have known about it since the 70s. And it's not just Brandenburg who's told me that. The artist Paul Lafole told me that. This is
Wow.
the book that's kind of there saying, like, NASA's known this shit on Mars since at least the 70s. And so if you want, rather than, I don't think there is a good, and this comes back to that Dr. Farrell stuff, like he's got his Cosmic War books, which I flipped through to see if I wanted to put on this list. And because I wanted something like that. Because this is a very dangerous corner of the cosmos that we live in, apparently, right? And sort of 500 million year old nuclear bomb signatures on Mars, I think is a good addition, because I'm not making any, I don't know how that happened, right? I'm not telling you a whole big Zechariah Sitchin style story about the Anunnaki or whatever. What I'm telling you is that as far as JPL and the rest of it are concerned, there is a weapon signature in the Martian atmosphere. And so that's kind of like another one of those. And he's, we both met him. He's kind of an odd duck, being very, very Christian, and writes books like this and then like Christian literature, like novels, right? He's a very odd kind of person, which suits it, because it not in a how to say this right. He has different social skills, and I think that's kind of helped do things like show up to events saying, like, please somebody tell me about, can anyone tell me what this could be if it's naturally occurring, and all the rest of it. So it's a very interesting journey. But like, basically the key bit there is that there is a weapon signature in the Martian atmosphere that's 500 million years old, or a billion. Like, it's that Half-Life stuff where it's that 500 million to a billion year old moment. And that's just one of those factoids that floats around in your head when you realize, God, this is what a strange cosmos we live in, right?
Yes, and I do love his work, and I love that perspective, and he is the guy to put it out there. But I'm just too ignorant of what chemicals, what radiation signatures necessarily signify And I just can't ignore the fact that maybe there's something that could cause that isn't a nuclear weapon. And
Sure.
maybe you don't even, he's a PhD, obviously plasma physicist. He worked for NASA forever. He'd be the guy to say, but at the same time, I just can't get out of my head that, like, I don't know if I can go to the mat for this perspective. It is interesting, and I can hold multiple ideas in my head of what could be in the ancient past, but it's just such a complex and specific signature that he's pegging to a nuclear blast. And it's like, well, would civilizations on Mars build their nukes the same way we do today? Even
So
it's like there's a lot
I
of stuff
think
like that.
that stuff doesn't, like, I went a little bit down the rabbit hole when I spoke to him about it. That stuff doesn't necessarily concern me because it does, like, it's universally considered artificial, but it's more like the other, even if it turns out to be naturally occurring, what we do know is that in the eyes of JPL and other kind of and NASA probably, but other kind of groups at that level in the 70s, they considered it to be artificial. So we kind of have from the 70s, like, call it a secret space program or a secret space discourse, at least from the 70s, right? So
Mhm.
that's one of the things that I think one way or the other it sticks on the book, because even if he's wrong, these guys who also think that are wrong, but that fundamentally changes how you run a space program. If you think, hang on a minute, something got bombed up there a while ago, what does that change how we engage in space? So for me, it's
Yes.
kind of like, um, there's no way it's not intriguing. Even if that turns out to be wrong, we're still left with like a classic conspiracy of NASA being never a straight answer, like not actually disclosing stuff that would be of interest, if that makes
It's
sense.
it's true. And I would also say that even if it was naturally occurring, we can pretty much say that a planet destroying event happened in the ancient past on Mars. So who knows what Mars would have looked like without that, whatever it was, whether it was man made or natural. It seems like the case is being made that Mars, to some degree, would have been more Earth like without this thing. And that's just a Pandora's box of
Yeah,
rabbit holes you can go down.
no, exactly.
It's a fun book
which
for sure.
which is all the list can really promise you. So we get to 6, and we have
Yeah.
reached our double up. Greg went with the real Anthony Fauci. So tell us if there's anything that I missed. Tell us
No.
your thinking.
Yeah, this is the one overlap, and it has to be on the list because of how big this campaign was, how effective it was. And I hope that people realize that they never want to get burned again after this. And it's just an ironclad case. It's again about the footnotes. It's about the research team that made sure every single line was a fact. It's just so ironclad, and it's action packed too. I mean, it's not, there's no wasted space in this book. I can't say that about everything on the list, but I felt reading through that there was no wasted space. When I prepare for an interview, I highlight quotes and then I make a list of quotes and then I narrow that down as to what actually can make it into a 2 hour interview. And I was highlighting so much of that book,
Yeah.
it was useless. I was like, well,
Yeah.
I need to slow down because there's just so many facts jam packed in it. And it's just such an important book. And yeah, everything we said earlier.
Yeah, nice. And I went with The Game of Nations by Miles Copeland because if there's ever a book, again coming back to that, he was a section chief at Cairo section chief for the CIA, and he wrote this book basically explaining all that's here's how we do stuff. We invent things like the Muslim Brotherhood, and we're trying to create like a pan Arabia because it's easier to control. We collapse governments to get the right fuel companies in, and this is what we do. This is like literally how we run the world by doing all this stuff that you and I know they do. But here's one of them inexplicably writing a book explaining exactly how it was done. And it made it into years ago Jay Dyer's like Globalist books or whatever it was called, that series before he went really quite dank. And because it's books written by people who are part of the elite, and I think they carry extra weight. So there's a couple of them sort of like on this list, because here is a guy who actually did it saying like, we did it. It's not an Alex Jones rant about frogs or something. And I love using that example because it turns out he was kind of right.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
uh, it's actually someone who's like, yes, I am or was the CIA, the Cairo section chief of the CIA, and I was friends with NASA, and that's the president, not the space program. And like, this is what we do, and this is how we run the world right now. And it's really interesting because I was looking back through it. America is no longer in that position. It's still trying to do it, but it's funny. Like the confidence that comes through in Game of Nations is very much of its time. I think he was section chief in like the 50s and bit of the 60s, right? The confidence that comes through is hasn't held up 50 years later. But it's one of those books. It's like, wow, okay, so that does happen. That they literally do collapse governments, and for like nefarious, it's almost banal. Like the point of the book is like, this is a game, that's why it's called that. It's almost banal, like they're just playing because the only thing that matters is winning, and he pretty much says that. Like there's no morality to it. It's just, we're going to win, we're going to make the most money, and we're going to do this. It's a terrifying book in many ways, but it'll change your life if you haven't read it. It's out of print, but it is, shall we say, very easily found in pirate form online. So if you haven't ever heard of it and wish to read it, you'll find like a photocopy PDF fairly easily.
Nice. This is obviously a really important layer of the conspiracy cake that I don't think my list hits on all that much. This is the first book I have not read that has come up. And I think the closest equivalent to me would be The Last Hegemony by F. William Engdahl, that also goes into this kind of thing. But when I said at the beginning I thought your list would be more highbrow, what I really meant is that you would have included books from people in the network. This is a good example. I almost put Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People
Yeah,
on the
good
list
choice.
because
Yeah,
that is similar. I mean, not similar, but in the sense that, like, I mean, he knows how these powerful people run their lives and everything. And that book contains a lot of that stuff about influence. I mean, that's the name of the game at those top layers.
yeah,
But
no,
good choice.
absolutely.
Material
Yeah,
wise, I know exactly what you're saying. And it is an aspect that is probably going to be recurring in our lives. So you better get schooled on it.
yeah. Engdahl's a good example. Like that's another one who hasn't, would be on my long list. It didn't make it on the short list. Is like always worth reading, right? And so I like Greg for number 5 has the Technocracy Rising, and this is another area that this is an area that I think my list is kind of weak on, where it's you can find it in some of the other books. But I went looking for. Speaking of Dr. Farrell, like his transhumanism book is a good example. Like his banking books, the first half of it is an excellent kind of like introduction to the history of transhumanism, and then he gets into the alchemical agenda stuff where it's a bit, that's when he crawls out on his proverbial twig. And so it didn't quite make it to the list. So where my list is softer is on something I think is wildly important to understand, which is what technocracy actually is as a sort of managerial ideology. And the person to do it, of course, is Patrick Wood himself. So tell us
Hmm.
your thinking behind it.
Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory in the title. Technocracy Rising, the Trojan horse of global transformation. That is Agenda 2030, World Economic Forum. It's all the things. And it does have a good section on the history of tech and think tanks and the philosophies and goals they wanted to achieve in the past, but have been waiting for the technology to catch up. It covers the spectrum of surveillance, climate policy, the global smart grid. I don't recall, but I don't think it gets as deep as it could have on the EMF aspects of the whole technocracy thing, the health aspects, but it's a blunt object. It tells you exactly what it is and why it's appropriate for the times. You mentioned the last book or the book before that, having to navigate Christianity, the Christian bent.
Yep.
That's in here as well. You got to have to navigate that. I rolled my eyes more than a few times, but because of that Christian bent, it also has some provocative language about the ghost in the machine and demons and AI, like maybe not specifically going that far, but it has a Christian thing going on with like technocracy equals Satan. And that type of language is just provocative to me, true or not. It keeps me reading. And so it's just the quintessential where are we now and what are they going to roll out in the very near future? And that's why it's there.
Yeah, no, good choice. And I went with this one, went on and off the list. This is The Psychic War by Elmar Gruber, which not a lot of people actually know about, right? But
Right. Me either.
speaking of like the Stargate program and all the rest of it, I wanted, so obviously you want to put something about remote viewing in there, but the good remote viewing books aren't conspiratorial,
Right.
right?
Right.
So the guys who are actually part of the program don't write necessarily conspiratorial books, and so this is almost a continuation of like behind the Iron Curtain stuff, right? Because consequently, some of it, because of when it was written, it's a bit out of, like, we know more about the Stargate program now. So this isn't a definitive rundown of US military remote viewing programs per se, but it does look at Russia's and it does look at the US and it looks at China's and the rest of it. So it's one of the only books that I know of that tries to cover almost like psychic espionage or paranormal espionage on a global basis in a reasonably credible way. It's a bit old now, so again, we know more, but people, I mean, how much do you know about China's psychic programs, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, obviously they're, I expect considerably more advanced now than they were then. But that's kind of, I wanted to, this is my somewhere in there MK Ultra Stargate program book, and I felt it sort of better to put it in a global context because I haven't found, I know, like, it's the same thing for you, like I haven't found a satisfactory book that would make the top 10 that's exclusively about and like Jim Mars's RV book, the original Stargate program book, is 30 years old now, and not, we know more about what went on. So that was one of the ones, that was the closest Jim Mars came to getting on my list. But that's my
Mm-hmm.
thought behind The Psychic War. Um, it's not my favorite book on the list, and this was the gap where other books would slot in and out of. But I kind of landed on this one, and I'm mostly happy with the choice.
Yeah, this would be the second book that I have not heard of. And
Right.
it sounds great. I love that it covers the spread of all that stuff in one book. Uh, I totally know what you mean about a lot of the remote viewing books, even though it was a military program, they aren't conspiratorial by nature. Like the men who stare at goats, they're like, well, we did this thing. It's not really a secret. Here's a major Hollywood picture about it. It just
Yeah.
didn't really work. And it's like, well, there's the rub, there's the lie. But
So I was
just
thinking more like Russell Targ's book isn't a conspiracy book, but it's still the best book on all his books. But like his book on remote viewing and pretty much how to do it, but also his experience with the Stargate program is the best book on it.
mhm,
But it's not, it can't fit in a conspiracy book list. Is my point. Yeah. But so this
yep.
one, it's fine. I just needed a again, I'm building that kind of like polemical case for, dare I say, Mr. Global, and it sort of works in that sense. All right, moving on to number 4. Greg, you went with Altered Genes, Twisted Truth. Excellent choice.
Yes, man. The subtitle being How the Venture to Genetically Engineer Our Food Has Subverted Science, Corrupted Government, and Systematically Deceived the Public. I mean, this is the textbook on GMOs. And
Yeah,
it's so important because it's a master class on corporate funded science and regulatory capture. And what's more important next to education and food? I mean, these are the two building blocks of society, of life, really. Obviously, food is really important, but in society, education is important. I had to have that book. I have to have this book. And you can extrapolate out the things that occur in this book, which is, again, ironclad, lots of footnotes, very well researched. You can extrapolate out a lot of the same tactics used in medicine and other areas of science and energy. And so it isn't just necessarily one thing, but it's also, there's so much talk about, oh, are GMOs really that bad? And I think one of the ops around GMOs is that they say, oh, well, if you graft two citrus trees together, that's technically modified. It's like, that is not what we're fucking talking about. Okay.
no.
That is not what we're talking about. Farmers do that. We're talking about laboratory genetic altering. And that, genetics is going to be the future, all this CRISPR talk and stuff. So this is a book that will lay a foundation where you'll never trust that bullshit talk about CRISPR and all that stuff. It's just really ironclad, one of the best books. A lot of them could have been on this list when it comes to GMOs, but this is the one that I went
Yeah.
with. I just think it crushes.
Yeah, it does. It's a really, really good choice. Really good choice. I went with the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is the updated version of Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And this
Amazing.
is a really good audiobook version of it too. This is one of those books. It's kind of small that I am desperate to have everyone in the world read.
Yeah.
Right. And this is another one of those insider books. So John Perkins was an economic hitman. So he kind of grew up in finance and became part of the public-private scam approach to essentially harvesting the natural resources of developing countries and by putting them into debt. So you show up, the hitmen will kind of show up and with a plan with IMF loans backed by it and the rest of it. And this happened while I was in Ecuador, right? And it's like, cool, here is our growth plans for you. And we're going to give you a loan at 5% to pay it off, which you kind of back with your natural resources. And that money, of course, goes to Western companies, particularly American companies, to do the actual work, whether it's electrifying cities or building railroads or what have you. So the IMF gives money to a developing country that gets given to American corporations that then get the money and build the thing, which doesn't result in the growth that the hitmen promise. And so they have to pay off the loans by selling assets or giving other companies access to their water rights and their mountains and the rest of it. And if you don't comply, you get assassinated. And this is a guy who did it. He wasn't an assassin, but he was the front end of that process. Now, I'm obsessed with this book. If you're listening to this, I'm not going to include the show notes or whatever, but if you just drop in Rune Soup, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you'll get my review of it. I've mentioned it a couple of times. Drop that into your search engine of choice and that will come up. Because it's a powerful book, and it's, I think, equally powerful because it's a limited hangout, because someone who has a job like that is plainly not telling the whole story in their confessions. And there's things you do when you realize you've been a bad guy, and his come to Jesus moment, which is where it gets interesting for me, is like quitting this and founding the Pachamama Alliance. So instead of like going in a church direction, this guy who used to be an economic hitman founds like a sort of shamanish environmental and indigenous rights kind of charity nonprofit in South America, which I hope is on the level. I haven't found anything to say it isn't, but and it actually does look like him having a moral realization that I can't live this way and I'm moving in a more moral direction. But it's nevertheless a organization that can be useful in like blocking and allowing rights for different groups into an area rich in natural resources. So there's an extra part of the story that I find interesting. It's plainly a limited hangout. But I do at the moment believe it is a genuine kind of like change of heart morality of someone who is honestly doing really bad things, like setting up the petrodollar. He was part of that group, right? And then it has this weird end where most of his other books are to do with shamanism and ayahuasca and so on.
Yeah, it is a great book, and if you could have saw my list as it was like, okay, now we're down to 20, now we're down to 15. It was one of the last books I cut, honestly. And it
Yeah.
was that limited hangout thing that just got me thinking. I was looking at the cover and this exact cover, and it's like the New York Times bestseller, and I was just like, maybe I'm getting fucked here. Maybe this
Yeah.
is not what I think it is. But it clearly does give you a really good base as to how these covert operations work, coups, influence, and in the context of what we just went through, a global vaccination campaign, global COVID policies, it kind of gives you a view into the window of like how global coordination
Yeah.
works. Once you've
People
compromised
forget.
a nation, yeah.
Yeah. It's
It's
a good
it's a
example.
it's a
So, like,
great book.
we all remember, was it Argentina that promised Pfizer some of their air bases, like some of their actual airports, to get access to the injections? And that was a Pfizer deal, in addition to like, you know, immunity from prosecution. It's like we also want an airport, like a
Yeah.
military airport. What?
Yes.
Right?
As soon as I heard a few of those things in early COVID, my mind went right back to this book because
Same.
that is the book that
Exactly.
laid the base for me to understand how that kind of stuff is done.
Well, this is the WHO treaty that they're still trying to get through, has the same kind of model where from whatever it is, Zurich, they can declare a pandemic in Wakanda or wherever they want, right? And what that does is unlock money immediately. So it's like, oh, Costa Rica, you have a pandemic. Here's $500 million in whatever CBDC we're running at that time, right? But that comes with the conditions. But it's the same idea of like pushing the money in to get people to comply with what they're doing. And this is the model. So if and there's a little video of John explaining it that I've got in my review, which is why if people want to find it, or you can just find that on YouTube. It's literally a 90-second animation describing the process. And once you see what that is, you can see it in all of this. Like we've just decided to move, as we've moved away because of technocracy and the rest of it, from running this on oil, from oil being like the primary real asset swap for this skullduggery. As we've moved into a more of a biological world, they've kind of shifted the deal, but the deal shape is the same. So it's built on this kind of like biopharma stuff, but it's the same general idea of like, we're going to give you things, and when they don't work, we're going to take stuff from you, basically.
Yeah,
it's yeah.
Well, it's just such a unique book. I don't know of many books like it.
Yeah, happy it's on the list. All
yes.
Right. Getting towards the end. Tell me, this is one I haven't read that's on your list. You've gone with AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire by Dr. Nancy Toner Banks. So tell me about that.
This was it made it on the list because I wanted a curveball, honestly. And again, it's a big, thick one. And it's funny that Confessions of an Economic Hitman was your number 4, because when I was looking at my list, I was like, well, a lot of that stuff is in this book plus more.
Okay.
And so that's kind of why I picked this one, because she is not ignorant to that capture of nations and the quid pro quo stuff that, is in that book. But she also does a real deep dive into like the rape of Africa, let's call it. That's where the diamonds thing comes in, the trafficking. She does.
And the AIDS thing.
Yeah. She has a little bit on the history of the British East India Company. So that's the one book on my list that is going to touch on a little of that history. It also is banking heavy. She is not ignorant to the banking powers involved in all this stuff. So it's not just the CIA screwing up the world. It's, well, there's partnerships with banks that are moving the money, that are encouraging a lot of this activity. So I feel like from that perspective, it's also really good. Another reason it's included, and I don't know if people watching will really be able to see, I always try to hold things up to the camera and it's kind of dumb, but there are a lot of things at the very beginning where, like, even just before you get started, this chart of how much each pharmaceutical company donates to Democrats and Republicans. It's just like,
nice.
And that's just one thing. There's a timeline of the AIDS crisis. So it's before you even get in the book. But this was really relevant to today. Right before you even start the book, factors known to cause false positive HIV antibody test results. Look at that list. It's basically like every illness you could have and the common cold, and flu is on that list as well. So I read this well before COVID, and it always just stuck with me that I'm reading HIV tests. So before I read this book, if I would have got an HIV test and tested positive, I'd have been like, oh my God, I don't know where this would have came from, but clearly the tests can't be wrong. It's just like we thought that way before COVID, I think. And then
being gay, I knew a little bit about that before. Like, I'm just going to jump in there, right? Because before I went to Peru for the first time, I had to go and get the yellow fever injections, not because Peru requires them, but Australia inevitably requires them to come back into the country you've been to Peru, right? So whatever. And I'm in there, and I just actually had a serious flu, and my doctor's saying like, oh, do you want an HIV test? And I'm like, I just told you about the flu, so I'm going to say no to that. And she's like, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Like, do. What the fuck, woman? If you
yeah.
What the fuck? Like I whatever the false positives that show up, like hangovers can do it, which I actually think catches a lot of gays.
I even wrote jotted a couple of notes for why I picked these books in case I forgot something, but I even wrote, this taught me that medical tests in general are just low immunity tests. Like, you have an immunity issue right now, so you pop positive, And whatever label is on the test, if it's a COVID test or an AIDS test, that's what you're going to pop positive for. So I was primed for PCR tests by this book. Also, she's a graduate of Harvard Medical School and has an MBA in finance. So when she
Okay.
folds in the banking stuff, she knows what she's talking about. This is also, I wouldn't say the only one on the list, but it's one of the few. Virus Mania qualifies, Dumbing Us Down qualifies, and Technocracy Rising qualifies. But those would be the books where I haven't interviewed the author myself. Honestly, I have tried to get at her. I have looked up, there's websites where they show you, you put in the name and they show you all the podcasts the person's been on. You can sort by date. I have gone to the most recent podcast she's been on, which are still years old. And when she gives out her website, she says it's nancybanksmd.com. You go to that website, it's nothing. It's gone. So there is no way for me to contact her, but this is people ask me all the time, who's on your short list you'd want to interview? It is her. It is her. She
Right.
is
Right.
amazing.
Well, Dr. Banks, if you're listening, I love me this sounds really crass. I love me a good blood diamond story. I love the kind of like, I don't love it, but like I'm fascinated by the De Beers diamond Africa story. Because when I
Very much in there.
worked in the east part of London, would have to walk past De Beers every day, and you'd see the helicopter leave at 4:45 every morning because they would take the money and everything out by the roof because it was too like it's still London, but they wouldn't take it out through the door. So you could kind of know it was time getting on for closing time because you'd watch the De Beers helicopter leave, and that kind of got me into it. But this will be a little Christmas present for Mr. White. I'm gonna
you'll like
get this
it.
for myself. So I went with this is another good example, and it's kind of a cheat because it's a trilogy. But I went with Sinister Forces by Peter Levenda, and this is kind of like a Joseph Farrell pick. But so Peter, who I like as a person, has never met someone else's idea he didn't like, and so this is a really good. If you understand what Peter's interested in, which is inevitably things like the Necronomicon, but also like Charles Manson and all that kind of like strange stuff. If you understand the things that Peter's interested in, this is a great book for kind of like a magisterial, and he's an excellent writer. So it's a really enjoyable read of the kind of like from the founding of the US up. This kind of like intertwining of stuff like MK Ultra and the witch trials and like spirits and demons and again Charles Manson and all the rest of it. So when I didn't have an MK Ultra book, I was a bit annoyed, but I'm like, actually I do have Sinister Forces as a trilogy in it, and you get a whole bunch of stuff that's in there. And like the reason I mentioned Dr. Farrell is Peter Levenda is very, very good at I don't mean this in a disparaging way, like using other people's research. So if you want like an overview of an area, a Farrell book or something like this from Peter Levenda is really good. But it's also just a really well written romp. And so I started the Gateway with a Kennedy and a lawyer. And as we move towards the top of the list, it does get a little bit wilder. But these are great books, and there's stuff in them that you go, that can't be right. And then off you go to find out, going, oh gosh, it's a little bit right. It's got everything. It's got like hidden American history, like the mound builders and all that kind of stuff. It's wild.
It's such a good book. I mean, the subtitle, A Grimoire of American Political Witchcraft. That is just so provocative. I do love that trilogy. Peter Levenda, I've interviewed him a couple of times, and it was only when he got into like the Secret Machines era. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he said something disparaging about conspiracy thinking. I don't know what it was, but it was so offensive to me that I was kind of like, you're burnt. You are burnt. I don't give a
No, I
fuck
get it.
about you anymore. But these books, Sinister Forces, are amazing. They would have made my list, but when I talked about that narrow criteria, they are books that I convinced myself didn't qualify because I needed to make room for the ones that squarely qualified, but amazing books.
No, I lost. Yeah, I lost Peter when he got involved with when he joined Blink 182. Which I'm pretty sure he just. There's something about him personality wise that I quite like. Having said that, the
He
thing
likes
about
to get
Peter, I think, is
involved.
that yeah, and like in a real chaosy way, like
Yeah.
to show up to like a Nazi retirement village in South America
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff. Like there's stuff that he can't. Uh, he's a little bit of a messy bitch and like some drama, right? I think there's that in his personality, and he wouldn't have got caught up in like weird bishop CIA stuff. He wouldn't have, dare I say, invented his own Necronomicon. He wouldn't have done all that if he didn't just like, yeah, didn't like drama, I think.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that was the pull towards the the previous attempt at official or approved UFO disclosure before we got into the Elizondo era, right?
Yes.
Um, so
What's
yeah,
also
but
funny about Sinister Forces is I think about it a lot. And of all the books on my shelf, if anyone's watching, Gordon has a full wall of books. I have a little space in between for a fireplace that is now my altar, if you can see in there. Such limited space in a San Diego home that like my altar is inside a fireplace, but I also felt it somewhat appropriate. But on the sides, it is flanked by two big bookshelves, and of everything on there, Sinister Forces, I look at it all the time and I'm like, put this by the bed and just start rereading it,
yeah,
because I know
yeah,
way more than I did when I read it. And I think I just remember the feeling of reading it and being like, this is provocative as hell. And I know going back now, I would probably get even more out of it. But because it is my job, sometimes I'm like, well, I'm not going to interview this guy again. So let me read
yeah,
something else
yeah.
where I might actually interview that person.
Well, let's make it like a plus member January activity.
That could be
Let's do a
cool.
Sinister Forces
Yeah,
reread.
we've talked
Yeah,
about doing a like some kind of book club thing where we could talk,
yeah.
because there's so many. My show is, and yours too. But you do more than just a show. But it's limited to the authors I can actually interview. But there's so many books where authors are dead or they just don't want to come on my show after the third time, and it would be great to do that. Yeah, we should. We should.
Yeah, because I would do a reread of it too. I think it's been a while for me. Anyway, all right, moving on to number two, and I've before. So
Ah,
Greg went with a magisterial choice, "One Nation Under Blackmail" by the amazing Whitney Webb, and I haven't read it, which is the only reason why it's not on my list. And but I will
mm,
say, um, it was this book, the publication of this book, that gave me the idea for this show, because obviously I listened to Whitney coming back on THC to talk about it, but I was also listening to her on being interviewed by Catherine on the Solari Report. And what Catherine said about the book, the first book, was, well, actually, it was the second book. It's like, in order to tell the Epstein story, you have to tell basically the entire story of the the Anglo-American intelligence establishment for the last 50 or 60 years. And when she said that, I'm like, oh, cool. That actually reminds me of. So that's where the idea of like, that would probably be a book you could give to someone
yes.
to say, here's some stuff that's very well documented that went on. And then that got me on the idea of like, well, what other books would you give people, and so on. And here we are doing the show. So even though I haven't read Whitney's book yet, obviously I will. She's the reason why we're actually even doing this episode. But tell me about your obviously excellent choice.
Yeah, man. If you've heard how dense and thorough her interviews are, then just imagine what she can do with 2 volumes of exposing this network of people. You are right about the history. This is one of the books on my list where it's like it does cover a huge chunk of that history. And it starts with the operation, I believe it was simply called Operation Underground, where they penetrated the mob and the mafia and all that kind of stuff, the criminal underground of America. And when they penetrated it, they just kind of like learned how they were doing it and then took it over. And we're like, well, we don't need you now. And something that came out of the book that was a light bulb for me, even doing a conspiracy show for 10 years, is she basically makes the point that any of the mob guys that got arrested through our lifetimes, 80s and 90s, and people convicted on tax evasion, or they got this guy, they got that guy, they're just eliminating competition. And I was just
Mm,
like, holy shit, that's a great, great point. Because I guess in my head, I'm like, well, the law enforcement and CIA, and the FBI, like they sometimes do the right thing, and then they also do all this criminal activity. And she basically was like, well, even when you think they're doing the right thing, they're just eliminating their competition. Their motivations are not pure. And I thought they just occasionally popped a guy just to at least make it look like they're doing something. But that ulterior motive, it just, I don't know, it was a light bulb moment for me. And it is just so dense and deep. Obviously, it's a 2-volume set. So that's, again, a little bit of a cheat. But blackmail is so clearly key to compromising and controlling a wide range of people, whether it's politicians or CEOs. And it's just so important. And again, it's a category. I couldn't have a top 10 list without a
Yeah.
book covering blackmail. And the Franklin scandal touches on it, but this is that and more.
Yeah, excellent. I'm looking forward to it. It's they're very difficult to get outside of the US or Europe at the moment because of the publisher. Not in a bad way, just like publishing agreements.
Yeah.
So they're very challenging to get down here. And I don't want a Whitney Webb book on an ebook form because
Oh, well.
it's too detailed.
Yeah, I
I'm
didn't
having
like that either. It's another one of those.
yeah,
The thing is when I know I'm preparing for a show, I sometimes buy these that I would consider the new classics to put on the
yeah,
shelf. But because of the process and like highlighting quotes, ebooks are
yeah,
better, but
fair
I
enough.
do hate ebooks.
No, yeah, she's too like God bless that neurodivergent genius, right? But like that's too much information for me to kind of like take in on a digital form. I need to be like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And like go back a page and
Yeah, you
and
will
whatever. But
like
I'm
it.
looking forward
It's
to
good.
reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looking forward to reading it. And I'm glad. So the other one, like in terms of classics, I wouldn't have been able to put this on this list, and I'm excited you did. The other one is, of course, the real Anthony Fauci, because one of the things that kind of hasn't been that many, which is hilarious given the times we're in. There haven't been that many great quote unquote conspiracy books the last few years, right? And I think these two are definitely the two, right? Real Anthony Fauci and One Nation Under Blackmail.
Just while you mentioned Anthony Fauci in that book, something that RFK Jr. said to me that I wasn't aware of at the time was, if you've seen the movie Dallas Buyers Club, that is exactly the story. It's a true story of what was going on at the time, but they never really name like the super villain or the villain of the movie,
Yeah.
but it is Fauci. And I just was like, damn. And then I rewatched the movie and it's like, wow, so obvious, so clear. What a great film, by the way.
Yeah. And my number 2 is UFOs and the National Security State, which again is another cheat because it's a multi-volume release from Richard Dolan. And I couldn't, especially if I'm thinking my way through the list of like, well, we're building out the, let's say, the mechanics of governance and some of the stuff that's in the shadows over the last 70 years. This is the book of receipts of
Yes.
like official announcements or disclosures or documents or what have you to do with the military interest and, dare I say, complicity in parts of the UFO phenomenon. And it's on the list for that reason, because he's an excellent historian who's put it together. Like Richard's a bit more extraterrestrial hypothesis than a lot more extraterrestrial hypothesis when it comes to what he thinks is going on than I am. It doesn't impact the fact that this is like the book if you want to know kind of like historically what verified kind of documents, if you will, are available showing the national security state's interest in UFOs, particularly in the post-war era. So this is kind of another one of those, like, if you read this, and it's really good in a funny way with like One Nation Under Blackmail. If you get through the list of all our books, you're going to, dare I say, know a lot more about what's going on, I think, because they actually complement each other in a lot of ways when you can kind of understand the corruption in One Nation Under Blackmail and the corruption in Pharma, like Real Anthony Fauci, and then you sort of understand this sort of shadow governing structure. I don't want to say shadow government exactly.
Yeah.
This sort of stuff fits in there, but that's why it's not the book about UFOs that I'm most closely aligned with. That would be more of a valet kind of direction, right? But it's the right book to be this high up in a top 10 conspiracy books of all time, I think.
You are so right. This was again on my top 15 that just barely got cut because I just got kind of in the mindset of, hey, it's game time. What would you need to know to be prepared for right now? And not that UFOs aren't relevant, but it just seemed a little fun to me compared to like the really dark, serious shit that we're going through. But I mean, it is a great, great pick. It was on my top 15. I love Richard Dolan. He is such a unique character. He's so kind. You know, after our last interview, which was nothing about UFOs, which is where he gained so much, I gained so much respect for him because I knew he did a Gaia TV series on false flags. He is a historian by nature. So that was so bold and brave of him to do a history of false flags. I learned about several events that I didn't even know about through that series. And I was like, wow, this is something you've done that to me is like your best work in a way. And yet it's not at all what you're known for, maybe because it was behind a paywall on some kooky new agey site. But I mean, it was just so great. And the last time I interviewed him, it was all about the COVID op and really just the deep state and propaganda and technocracy. And man, did he crush it. I mean, when he goes
Oh,
on
yeah.
a rant about technocracy, it's just so articulate and you could cut out so many great clips. And after the interview, he was just really kind to me too. That's another bummer of a thing that happens to me is after I rap, guests will give me so many compliments. And I'm like, well, that's not going to make it to air. But he was so nice. And he was like, dude, this is our second interview. I really remember the first one fondly. I will never overlook a request from you again. You know, we'll see if that's true or not, but he meant it in the moment. He's in high demand. I wouldn't hold him to it, but he was like, you're a great interviewer. You ask me questions other people don't ask me. You take me in directions that I don't have to usually go. And he likes that. He's one of those guys that likes to go into new areas. And that's kind of my attitude is why am I going to do the 200th interview with Richard Dolan if I don't have some different things to ask him about?
Totally. He's
Great pick,
amazing.
though.
And as you say, genuine guy, amazing, beautiful wife. I got to be at their wedding in Uluru in Australia some years back.
Yeah.
Just, as you say, really, really nice guy, and I could listen to him forever on anything, as you say.
Yeah.
Like
Amazing
it's just
recall
yeah.
for dates and names. No matter what you throw at him, you know, he thinks you're going one direction, you throw something out, and then he's off on another tangent that is so deep. It's like I would have had to have notes. I would have had to been
Oh yeah,
prepared for that
he'll know
question.
the section chief of some bumfuck nowhere, 1978, who saw a light in the sky near an Air Force base. Like, yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Great pick.
all right.
Great pick.
So, what do you think? What do you think the number one is? As we move on to the final slide, second final slide.
Your number one?
Yeah, what do you think your number one
Oh,
is? My number one, rather.
well, and it has no overlap. It is tough to say. Man, I feel like we hit all the major authors. Maybe you did do something like 1984 or Carol Quigley, or maybe it's Klaus Schwab. Maybe it's Klaus.
All right. No, you actually got it. The
Oh,
list. My number one. Number one is Tragedy and Hope.
yes.
You just aren't. You do not know what's going on until you've read this book. It's as
Yeah.
simple
Well,
as
look
that.
at
But
these two picks. This is how different we are. I mean, this is the
I know, and I have to
highbrow,
fucking.
and this is down in the muck
All
bullshit
right,
from
I
me.
have to ask. I mean, obviously, I'm going to ask you, but like, okay. So, for people listening, it is the David Icke Guide to the Global Conspiracy and How to End It. Is Greg's number one choice. All right, I haven't read it. I haven't read a David Icke book in a while. I can't remember the last one it was in London. It was about it must have been 8 years ago. Another usual big thick book, but I haven't read this one. So tell me, Greg, what's going on?
Well, you are not going to get a physical copy of this easily. It's out of print. There's obviously a
Okay.
Kindle now, but it's a silly choice, kind of. Honestly, it was on my list. And then when we decided to put them in order, I was like, oh, well, this will be 10. And then I started moving it up more and more because I went back and looked at it. So this is a book from 2007. It is, I think, the first conspiracy book I purchased. I would have been 2 years dropped out of high school. I guess I'd have been, or college. But I guess I would have been around 21 or 22 and broke. But I was like, I'm going to pick up this book because I hadn't actually really read a book that tried to cover the spread. And this covers so much. It does cover globalization. It covers politics, geopolitics. It covers secret societies. It covers the things like the Iran-Contra affair that are kind of boring. It covers some of the economic hitman stuff but then it also covers maybe the Queen's a lizard person. And I felt like David Icke deserved a place. He is such a thorough writer. For the people watching, I also have here his book, The Trigger. This might be the thickest book on my
Wow.
shelf, and this is just about 9/11. I mean, it's nuts. And this particular book, another reason why I kept moving it up is because when I looked at it again, and I knew it was going to be a Rune soup thing, you know, maybe one of the biggest conspiracies is materialism. And his
Sure.
first two chapters shatter that. So the first two chapters of this book are about materialism as an op. I think the first chapter is called Who Are You? And the second chapter is Where Are You? And it is very metaphysical. And so the crux of this book overall, though it does get into all those little sagas of corruption and CIA coups and all that kind of thing, the biggest conspiracy is you are an insignificant speck in a meaningless universe. And this is a very empowering book that says, no, you are important. You know, there is a spiritual journey here. You manifested here for a reason. You are a part of the Godhead. You are infinite consciousness having an experience, a human experience. That's like his big quote. And so it even talks about plagues and biomedical stuff in 2007. So it's relevant to the times. It's all the deep history you want. And it's to the nth degree speculation. But the crux of it is materialism is an op that filters into all these sub ops across the board. Like I also wanted to include some kind of secret energy Tesla tech book. I had a couple of picks for that because that is suppressed information. Dr. Paul Laviolette has a couple great books on that and hidden energy. And I didn't include that because I guess I considered it not qualifying, but it's in this book too. But that is the crux of it, is I wanted something from the king, and you're always hitting the hammer down on materialism. And this book's crux is that like that's a giant op, and you should know about your infinite consciousness.
Yeah, no, I knew there'd be a thinking behind it, and it's what a strange world we live in, right? Where I think he's banned from the EU, or he
Yeah.
was kicked out of the EU or something. So it's still a dangerous statement.
No.
He's made other dangerous statements as well, but no, I figured, because I haven't read it, it was going to be because
The
it is, yeah,
encyclopedia.
all encompassing, right?
Yeah.
Is one of the things. But also, I kind of see the logic in it as well. You've earned a David Icke book once you've got through 2 Whitney Webb books. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. This is my one
uh,
chance to be silly, and this is obviously seems like your most serious choice.
I would say so, just because it's so. Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley is essentially a insider historian's account of what the CFR and other Anglo-American groups intended to do while they were doing it. So he was a military historian who put together, like, who cataloged the emergence of the Anglo-American ruling set, and how it rules through think tanks and all the rest of it, which is still in play now. Like, once you read this book and spend a few seconds, and that's really all it takes, watching commercial media, and you realize they're interviewing people from think tanks, or a certain think tank said this and all this. Who fucking cares? They're just they're just like Princeton fucking graduates living in DC. Like, no one, who cares what they think? But apparently we run the whole world on think tanks and these little roundtable groups and so on. And that all emerged intentionally as a kind of continuation in this book. There's a continuation of almost like British style governance of planet Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at things like G7 and the Davos class and the rest of it, it is a Anglo-American structure designed to manage the world for not even what they would view to be nefarious purposes, but because they believe this is the best way to manage the world, right? And this is the story of it. And much like the Miles Copeland book and the John Perkins book, not that he's like an insider in that sense, but he had access to CFR archives, and they're like, here, just tell the story of what it is we're doing. And he did, and you can just read it. You can just read how we're governed,
Mhm.
essentially, and it is critical. It is a critical, albeit boring, in some places. Like a military historian shouldn't be let loose on history books that cover the war, because you learn a lot about different artillery and stuff that you can skip it, right? But this is a powerful book that puts all of them together. And if you read this in conjunction with real Anthony Fauci and Whitney Webb, you're like, shit,
Yeah.
look at what's going on.
It's true. It's so important. It is a book that I made myself read once I realized this was going to be my career for a while. I knew I wasn't going to interview the guy and I knew that it was going to be dry, but I felt like I had guests that were talking over my head and I didn't know what they were referencing. And so I was like, I have to read this book. And yeah, it's foundational. I do struggle with like, how did this get, is this limited hangout too? How did this get written?
I honestly think at the time they thought they were about to win. That's all I've got.
Ah, yeah.
Um, I
That's
think because it takes a couple of years to write it. I thought at the time that whatever the plan was, how they were going to fold China back in, or make the UN a proper governing, like a proper world government. The only thing I can think of is that they were about to win, and so well, we might as well get the history book sorted. That's all
yeah.
they've got. But the Miles Copeland confidence is in there, where obviously Miles Copeland's book was 20 years before, give or take. The events were 20 years before. But he has that same, like, well, we're going to win. Like, since you're all going to die anyway, why not tell you kind of
Yeah.
attitude of like, nothing's going to stop this.
It's like the
And there's
supervillain monologue.
yeah, and the only thing I could think of with Carol Quigley is that there is some, like, when people try to look for stuff that is and isn't mentioned, like, oh, he never mentions, what is it? He doesn't mention the Rockefellers, but he mentions like other banking groups. So there's a whole like, it is a limited hangout. I'm like, yeah, a very limited hangout.
Mhm, mhm.
You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
so he didn't mention one banking family. No, it was another one. Maybe it was the Morgans. Maybe he didn't mention J.P. Morgan, but he did mention the Rockefellers. I'm completely blanking on it now. But there was one group that was, or one banking family that he specifically didn't mention, that people point like, so it's propaganda for them. I'm like, it's pretty weird propaganda for a banking family, but yes, it is a necessary book,
It is.
if not as fun as David Icke's. But
And
it really did, like, you see the world differently, and you can navigate it differently, and it's certainly helped me in doing that, in managing personal and medium term risk, like where I live, what I do with assets, the rest of it. Because once you understand this group, and other books on this list give you their objectives, you're like, okay, what am I going to do with that?
right. And David Icke's book, not only the metaphysical, but it goes into archons, it goes into credo mutwa. So there's a little bit of like respect for indigenous beliefs in there. And as I was looking at it, I was like, damn, this book, this was one of the first ones I read, and I'm still talking to people about these same things. And there's other people who don't even get aspects of this that do seem really important, and it obviously has the Rockefellers in it. That is another kind of glaring hole in my list. It obviously makes it into the encyclopedia book, but really the best material on the Rockefellers is James Corbett's How Big Oil Took Over the World, and that's a documentary. So, uh,
Agreed. Yeah.
Battle Hymn.
It's,
There's a
yeah.
book called Battle Hymn by John Skura and someone else. And that someone else, I can't remember his name, but he was more religious. So he injected a lot of religiosity into the book. But John Skura's part of the book is just a deep biographical history of Rockefellers and Rothschilds. And I had that book. I interviewed him for my 50th anniversary back when I was still counting shows. And he basically gave us the raw history. And it's a great book, but the cover has like a demon on it, and it's called Battle Hymn. And you don't
Right.
expect it to be just a great biography of these powerful families, but it is. And it almost made my list, but it just has too much of that other residue. So it didn't. But yeah,
Right.
Rockefeller is obviously an important family to fit into this.
All right. So speaking of stuff that didn't make it to the list, we have mentioned some of them as we went along. I mentioned Underworld, for instance, and Jacques Vallée didn't make my list, which might surprise or upset people. But the closest to conspiracies, well, not closest to, right? Like messages Messengers of Deception would be the closest to that, would have made it on the list. Dark Alliance by Gary Webb, Penetration by Ingoy Swan, Final Events by Nick Redfern. And this is the only novel, funny you mentioned that, like Vatican by Malachi Martin, because if I still think that's the best overview from a, I guess, like very traditional Catholic, very trad Cath perspective of what happened to the Vatican from like the late 1800s through the 20th century, making a deal with the high Masonic powers of Europe and the Nazis and so on. And the best way to actually get that information is in this actually otherwise kind of boring novel called Vatican. But like, what was on your medium or like long list that you think you should mention? Or the other one was Operation Gladio. I didn't get
Yeah.
anything in that, but what was on yours?
Well, Dr. Mary's Monkey was on there. The subtitle,
Such a good book.
How the Unsolved Murder of a Doctor, a Secret Laboratory in New Orleans, and Cancer-Causing Monkey Viruses are linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and Emerging Global Epidemics by Ed Haslam.
It's so, what do you think's going on there? Like, I've read that book. I've listened to a bunch of his interviews. I've got that book. It's so weird.
It's strange.
Like,
it's strange. And
you just, when you think, speaking of JFK being like boring, just when you think you've got the story down pat, it's like, oh, you know, military industrial complex. He wants to end the war. He wants to break the CIA. You're like, I get why they killed him. And then this guy comes along and is like, actually, there's like a ray gun and
yeah, it's gnarly. That's
there's
why
like a ray gun in New Orleans. And yeah.
it was going to be on the list because if we're talking about the best conspiracy books, it is better than a lot of the books, but it's so inconsequential. What are you going to do with this information? It's a saga. It's a story that happened. I mean, Ed Haslam's father worked with this woman who died under mysterious circumstances, and he kept pulling that thread, and the story unraveled. It's fucking interesting, but what are you going to do about it? What's the actionable intelligence here? And I just cut it for that reason. To be quicker about it, Fleshing Out Skull and Bones by Anthony Sutton, really great.
Yeah.
Where Did the Towers Go by Dr. Judy Wood. When I was doing a category type list, I was like, what's the best 9/11 book? This one. Although the best 9/11 book in terms of actionable intelligence should be something about the Patriot Act and the surveillance state, because going forward, that's important to know. And this is such a narrow focus on what did take the towers down. I have it here. Not only is it thick and huge, but it's also like probably one of the best produced books that I would have considered. It's got so many images because images are required to make the case that some exotic technology took those towers down. She's also, in my 12 years of podcasting, the only guest who, when I sent her an interview request, she sent me a quiz about her book. She's like, I'm not going to do this interview unless you understand and have read my book. And she's dead serious. She does not mess around. And she can, everybody gives her shit. Like the op against her was, oh, space lasers took down the towers. That is not what she says. She says that it was some kind of microwave technology that you cross fields and you can dustify the buildings. And she goes into avenues of research, like approaches to solving the question that you wouldn't think about, like the water table below the towers and how it's constantly monitored for seismic activity, and there was no reading. You would think that these many tons of steel and rubble crashing to the ground would cause a seismic activity that could be measured, but it didn't. So her point is that they were dustified in the air, and it didn't all come crashing down in some pancake effect. We've all seen it, but the weird effects she shows infused metals with other material. And it's like, that is the kind of thing that would happen. The only other conspiracy where that's talked about is like the Philadelphia experiment. They made a ship disappear. They brought it back and people were infused with the wall because they moved while it was like dematerialized. So there's material that is fused with other material that just doesn't happen with two planes flying into buildings. So it's so important, and it's very exotic and far out, and it's very well researched. So, I mean, it was going to be on my list, but again, what are the consequences of it? What are you going to do with it? to be faster about it, EMF'd 5G, Wi-Fi, and cell phones by Dr. Joseph Mercola. One of the best wide range EMF damage books. It is conspiratorial. It just didn't make the list because it's in the Jim Marrs book. It's kind of in the
Yeah.
David Icke book. It's important, but it just got cut. I mentioned Turtles All the Way Down, The CIA Doctors, Human Rights Violations by American Psychiatrists by Colin A. Ross. When I had a category for MK Ultra, it was going to be a Colin A. Ross book. Richard Dolan was on my cut list. Daniel Estulin, who wrote The True Story of Bilderberg, Sinister Forces, a couple of Jim Marrs books. And then when I was like, what is the best education book? It was clearly the one I picked, Dumbing Us Down. But Joseph Farrell wrote Rotten to the Common Core, which is more about technocracy and education. That's great. And then there is another education. Oh, School World Order by my man, John Kleizek. So not only is this guy just he's become a friend of mine, but School World Order is such a great title for a book about technocracy and education. And he crushes it as well. Another two books I was going to fit in were The Fix Is In and The Fix Is In 2. They got cut, but they are about sports in America. You know, the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, and NASCAR. Brian Toohey wrote these books making the case that it's all fixed. The mob knows who's going to win. They make these massive bets. They are making tons of money. It's all a show. Even in the NFL's there was a court case where the NFL, there was a team that got caught cheating. They went to court. They got sued because like somebody was like, hey, I paid to see a game. And they went to court and the court ruled, no, you paid to be entertained. It says that it's sports entertainment. So the fact that the game was fixed and there was cheating is irrelevant to the fact that you bought a ticket to the game. It's like WWE wrestling. So I love those books because he's picked a niche that no one's really talking about, that sports are completely fixed and it's fun.
Yeah.
It's just a fun one.
Yeah.
And then just Missing 411 I cut because I didn't think it fit. Dark Mission I cut because of it not having a lot of actionable intelligence. And Forbidden Archaeology was also on my list and got cut at the last minute because it's just like probably a little outdated, but it was a seminal.
Yeah, it's still, again, that's my underworld problem. Like, it's still not quite conspiracy. Like, yeah, not in the same way as the stuff on our list has been, I think. But yeah, I think it's of its time. It's another religious book. People just don't realize it. Yeah.
I also wanted to do something on the entertainment industry, assassinations in Hollywood, or the music industry. Mark Devlin's book, Musical Truth, is very good about the musical corporate industrial complex, but it just didn't make the list.
No, again, it's one of those, it's sort of in some of them, like when you can kind of realize, like, so the Laurel Canyon stuff is sort of in like some of these books, but again, it doesn't, because we only had 10. I get what you mean. Like, because I thought the same thing. Like, do we need like a Hollywood or Laurel Canyon book? And I'm like, it's covered in some of them. And actually, speaking of, if you pull on the Miles Copeland thread, you end up quickly in Musicland. But I'll let people do that themselves.
So what did you
understood?
cut?
So again, Underworld, Cosmic Trigger, because I actually picked up like Robert Anton Wilson's Everything is Under Control, and it's boring. It's like it's basically an encyclopedia. It's very much a pre-internet object. Not conspiracy enough. Like, it's got them in there, but it's, if anything, these books are useful to help you to provide a way of navigating being in conspiracy, I guess, right? But yeah, Dark Alliance is covered in my stuff. That's why, like, it's not on the list, but it's excellent. And Penetration by Ingo Swann, that was the one that was swapping in and out for whatever it was, the Elmar Gruber book, because it's so weird and so out there. But Ingo doesn't lie. Like, no one who ever knew him said like he's a liar. And this is the story of, like, you know, underground bases and bases in mountains and UFOs sucking up like lakes and all this kind of stuff that he went through. So that is pretty wild and out there. But again, when I was thinking in my head of like, I'm essentially trying to paint a picture of Spectre, right? To get people to understand the group that's running the planet, or more or less, right? The group that we could call Spectre or Mr. Global or the Anglo-American establishment, and it doesn't quite fit in there. So that was the one that I'm annoyed about getting off the list. And the other one was Final Events by Nick Redfern, which is a really good book at understanding like other hypotheses that were floating around in the military as to what's going on with UFOs. But again, Sinister Forces covers a lot of that, so that's what took that one off my list. Yeah, so we're being helpful to you listening. We've kept the book list down. Although, I'm sure if you are listening, you've just picked something you want to buy for yourself. I know I have. So I've got two of your list. Well, I was always going to get Whitney's book anyway, but yeah. I'm gonna treat myself.
I love it.
This has been really good.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I thought it was a great approach to doing a show. You set it up. I loved it. Hopefully we can do magic books on my show, but I don't know if I've even read 20 magic books.
Yeah. So, well, we can do other stuff. We can do because it's weird. You mentioned like James Corbett. He's actually got a couple of documentaries that, if they were books, would have made it onto my list as well. So we can do it with films,
That's true, but we could also just flex it a little bit to be magic, occult, paranormal, and then I definitely think we could do like that would make it similarly hard, because we'd have Valet, we'd have Missing 411, we'd have to make some tough choices if we broaden.
Let's even just drop magic then. Let's just do it as a paranormal or something. If people want to, I'm keen. We're heading into the silly season. We can do some fun recording. But this has been really good. I can't believe it's been too long since you were on the show, but I'm glad we got you back with a bang, Mr. Carlwood.
Well, I love you, and I know that I have enough self-awareness to know that I don't have a huge place on this show. So I appreciate bringing me back. It's not a conspiracy show. It's not a conspiracy show.
Yeah, but that's also a pattern of behavior with you, and I feel obligated to speak up for other Plus members every time you do that. Every time you're like, why would people want to talk to me? I don't know anything. And we all kind of like want to punch you in the neck.
I know. I'm trying to do it less, but the alternative is I could be some crazy egomaniac like James or Steven Crowder or something. Good like point. You don't want that. You don't want that. So let me stay humble before it goes to my head eventually.
All right. Well, once again, thank you very much. And obviously for people, if you're listening to this, you know exactly where to find Mr. Carlwood at Higherside Chats, where all good podcasts are found. And thanks once again, and speak to you soon.
Cheers, man. Thank you.